Welcome everyone to this afternoon dialogue session on social resilience and climate migration. Thank you for staying with us throughout today. Thank you again to Sonia and her team for amazing work in putting this together. And the University of Miami Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas is delighted to have been able to be a part of this amazing day and to share with all of you. We have just under an hour with you until just about 4:30 today, Miami time, EST, and we're looking forward to a dynamic discussion. In recent weeks, we have seen a swelling of numbers of migrants at the border. So this over and over again being told to us in the news. And in South Florida, we've seen repeatedly in the past decade, natural disasters, growing climate stressors, and the suffering and adversity that brings, and the flow of people up north. From one part of a region to the other, whether we're speaking of Haitians stranded in makeshift informal settlements in the Bahamas, or Puerto Ricans seeking houses and job opportunities beyond their island borders, there is a growing number of displaced and suffering people due to climate change. Climate-induced threats imply direct consequences to the health and well-being of individuals, whole populations, as well as our world, and also to economic stability. Small island states are especially vulnerable, but so are the poor. Preparing for this session, I was looking through today's notes from the New York Times, and it didn't take me long. It was the number 2 to read this one. We are doomed. Devastation from storms fuels migration in Honduras. Children pry at the dirt with sticks, trying to dig out parts of the homes that have sunk below ground. Their parents, unable to feed them, scavenge the rubble for remnants of roofs to sell for scrap metal. They live on top of mud that swallowed fridges, stoves, and beds, their entire lives buried beneath them. Andrew Seeley is quoted from the Migration Policy Institute, and he says an event like the COVID recession plus 2 hurricanes and the potential for an even bigger spike is so much more salient, so much more worrisome. Months after the hurricane, houses remain underwater, gaping holes have replaced bridges. Thousands of people are still displaced, living in shelters or on the street, and hunger is stalking them. This is Honduras, but I could have been speaking about many other parts of our region and the suffering that implies. I am pleased and at the same time saddened that we need to do this panel. But I'm pleased that we have an amazing group of 4 panelists to join us today. First, Professor Hearns Marcelin, professor of social sciences at our University of Miami and chancellor of the Inter-University Institute for Research and Development in URED. He's the co-founder and director of the Global Health and Society, an interdisciplinary and cross-campus graduate program at the University of Miami. His research examines questions related to health and human security, the roles of power, violence, and marginalization in society. Dr. Alejandro Portes, a renowned sociologist, the Howard Harrison and Gabrielle Snyder Beck Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Princeton University, and very proudly for our university, Professor of Law and Distinguished Scholar of Arts and Sciences in Miami. He is the founding director of the Center for Migration and Development in Princeton, and he's a very, very close collaborator with our University of Miami Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas. Professor Justin Stoller, Associate Professor of Geography and Regional Studies and Public Health Sciences at the University of Miami. His research explores global health disparities, particularly in low and middle income countries, and environmental impacts on social and behavioral epidemiology. And our guest, Dr. Adelle Thomas, Senior Caribbean Research Associate for the Impact Project and part of the science team at Climate Analytics. Her particular focus is on aspects of social vulnerability, adaptation strategies, and loss and damage. Since November 2019, Adelle is also director of the newly established Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center at the University of the Bahamas. Welcome to all 4 of our panelists. More information on their distinguished work and their long bios are available online to all of those listening. We're going to have a very dynamic discussion here. We do welcome questions in the chat. If we don't get to them, we will make sure to share them and our panelists can get to them later, but please do go ahead and send those through. But in the meantime, in beginning with our interactive dialogue and with Adele, the passing of Hurricane Dorian had very direct consequences on the lives of Bahamians. Homes, jobs, and services disappeared overnight. How has that impacted migration from the Bahamas to other destinations? And what of the population, for example, previously living on Ragged Island? Adele, please.
Hi, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. I think in response to that question about Hurricane Dorian, it really was an unprecedented event for us. We have had, bad hurricanes in the past, but this was by far the worst hurricane that we've had. It hit our second and third most populous islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama and caused lots of internal displacement. I think what is important to understand about Dorian is that we're still processing what happened. So right now I'm working on a project where we're trying to actually pull information from all of the different agencies that worked with displaced people, just to try to come up with a number as to how many people were actually displaced. Our missing people's list that we have is still not accurate. And this just speaks to, the challenges that Dorian brought with the magnitude of destruction that it caused. So in terms of migration, we had people that moved within our islands. Lots of them came from Abaco and Grand Bahama to our capital island of New Providence. But then some people also left the Bahamas completely and went to the US or went to Canada or went elsewhere. And what's telling is that we don't know how many people actually did that. And so trying to figure that out in the context of COVID, which has completely shifted people's attentions onto COVID, it really shows, the magnitude of the challenges that we have to try to address, trying to figure out what happened with Dorian on top of now trying to figure out what's going on with COVID. And really, we're still trying to process both of them.
That's interesting because if you don't mind, I would like to jump in. I mean, Adele, in what you said, you talked about, the whole difficulty to capture, to have accurate information about those who have been victimized, the vulnerable. In general, that's exactly the patterns that we find in the context, in the case of Haiti, after Hurricane Matthew. One of the biggest challenges that everybody was facing was that, how do you reach those who have been more affected first, and second, how many people have been affected, in which community they have been affected. And in our case, we have a weak, central government, a weak governance, disaster governance, and a weak, a warning system, and a weak, mechanism for recovery. So what will happen is that you have populations that are already vulnerable. Their livelihoods have been totally disrupted. Their worlds have been totally disrupted, destabilized, and they are up in the air. And the state or the international agencies and the NGOs are not able to give a clear account as to what had happened and what is happening to these people. So one of the clear, I think, lessons and one of the clear emerging kind of understanding that we are seeing with climate, driven, social processes, social disruptions, is that first, it unveils to us what we already live, what people already live. I mean, the scope and the scope of vulnerabilities of people. But second, the most important thing is the fact that people have to create their lives. They have to reinvent their lives, and therefore they are circulate. So in the case of Haitians who were in the Bahamas, some of them went back to Haiti, couldn't stay in Haiti, now, went to Latin America and to come back to the United States. So you have a process of circulation that is, constant, and people are on the move. And those people who are on the move are those precisely who cannot settle, or when they are settled in the areas and places that are the most vulnerable. And of course, the consequences of that for children, for women, for livelihood in communities, the consequences of these restrictions are tremendous. So I just wanted to, piggyback on that and to show precisely the whole problem of accountability and accuracy of data on local people who have been totally disrupted, lives that have been totally disrupted, is a kind of common trend. And second, the circulation, the movement of these populations who remain up in the air without any kind of strong access to institutions in order for them to find ways to rebuild their lives. So, the only thing that can happen is for them to continue to be on the move. And this is something that's fundamental in the kind of research that we are doing.
Thank you, Hans. I'm going to turn now to Alejandro. And again, as I said, we have with us truly a world-class sociologist who produces about a book a year, given that we're launching about a book a year, thanks to him at our institute. It's a general question, Alejandro, but how do climate events pose challenges to human populations? But, I'm especially interested in having you share some of your thoughts on children, which I think is a topic you've been looking at recently. You're on mute, Alejandro.
Technology. Let me take a few minutes to make basically 2 points. First, not all climatic events are the same, and we need to make a distinction between them in order to refine our analysis. At the very least, you can distinguish between regular catastrophes and irrecuperable cataclysms. Catastrophes are the regular material of the daily news. Although people perish in them, like in different hurricanes, and there can be enormous material losses, they are eventually recuperable. Over the centuries, humankind has learned to cope with these disasters, to return to the scene of destruction, and rebuild, often many times. The Bahamas is a case in point. Haiti, the city of New Orleans, is constantly attacked and suffering natural disasters, either floods or cataclysms, either floods or hurricanes. Cataclysms are a different matter. They are not recuperable, and the species that are affected cannot return to the scene of the tragedy and rebuild. The asteroids, the asteroid that hit Yucatan at the end of the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago, is the exemplary such events as an irrecuperable cataclysms. The dinosaurs could not recoup and continue their rule on planet Earth. They simply cease to exist. The reason for having now so many conferences these days about climate change and coastal erosion is that there is a growing fear among all of us, people who are informed, that the same thing that happened to the dinosaurs 65 million years ago may happen to the human species if we are not careful. We may be indeed at the end of a precipice with only decades to spare. The ice is melting ceaselessly in the poles, and that ice cannot be brought back. And the heat building in the oceans is already there. It's a fait accompli. It cannot be recuperated. Second point that I wanted to make in these brief comments is that it is important to distinguish between natural events and socio-political events, or more specifically, between climatic disasters and institutional disasters. Many of the worst consequences of natural disasters would have been preventable through more effective anticipation and reaction by the responsible institutions. Those include preparedness, involving the training of the population, deployment of resources in defense of vulnerable areas and communities, and the rapid care of victims afterwards. Many of the worst natural catastrophes in recent years that we have seen are less climatic than institutional, because they could have been prevented or their effects greatly ameliorated by a robust institutional response. Forest fires in California, triggered by the stubborn commitment of electric companies to deploy their cables and wires among the trees can be cited as a clear example of institutional failure. Hurricane Maria did far more damage to Puerto Rico than was necessary if proper governmental preparatory and remedial institution measures had been in place. Last year's hurricane in Central America, in Guatemala and Honduras, that in part triggered these caravans, the massive exodus that we are seeing, can represent a third example. And as a brief counterfactual, one can mention the case of Cuba, that despite being a poor country and relatively authoritarian, have developed fairly effective institutions to cope with regular disasters of the hurricane kind, and ameliorated and protected the population in better ways than, for example, what happened in Puerto Rico or what happened in Honduras and Guatemala. Preventing an irreversible cataclysm is subject to the same logic. Unless there are rigorous, science-minded, and incorruptible institutions that are put in charge of preventing a steady global warming, for example, we are marching inevitably into the abyss. Global warming did not come out of the blue, did not come out from the heavens. It was man-made and is now a man-made existential threat. And preventing an irreversible cataclysm depends largely on a collective response governed by the quality and power of the state and institutions as a key respect. We see I make two final asides. In South Florida, we are continuing to see building of enormous condominium towers right by the ocean, one after another, when we know what is going to happen, and then inevitable rise of the seas. The cities have all created these called resiliency offices as a way to respond to the climate change, but they have not been effective or powerful enough into this relentless growth. Second and final point, the largest displacement of population that we see in the Americas today comes out of Venezuela, of which there are about 6 million people deployed. That was not a natural disaster. It was not a hurricane that triggered that deployment. It was an institutional disaster that is governed by the implosion of the state and the institutions of that country. So when we talk about climate change, I am afraid that many times this other aspect of sociopolitical governance tends to be neglected by illustrating the enormous disaster, what had happened, but not paying attention to the fact that often there is significant variability into what natural disasters can do, depending on governance, on the quality of institutions in different parts of the country, and we have both cases, positive and negative, to illustrate that trend. That's the socio-political angle that I wanted to call attention to.
I'm going to get back to you on the children's point, but later on. We had a lunch conversation, Paul Farmer and myself, and what we spoke about in terms of pandemics was that pandemics are also human-made. Epidemics are human-made, and when you have a confluence of a human-made disaster and a natural disaster caused by humans, you have a terrible combination. So we will get back to this.
Well, actually, I can summarize it here in saying children are usually the most vulnerable elements of the population and the most likely victims of both climatic and socio-political events. They are the weakest part, and we have seen it. We have seen that in many ways, from natural disasters to governmental created disasters, as in the case of the last administration in this country.
And more to come, I fear. Justin, how have the primary drivers of migration changed in the past generation? Given climate change, have they changed at all? What is climate change doing in terms of our drivers of migration?
Thanks for that question, Felicia. I take a more big picture look to some of the factors shaping climate migration. And I'd have to start by saying most migration theories view migration as a decision in anticipation of improvements to one's life, broadly speaking. Though the various theories over the decades have operationalized migration differently, the context that traditionally leads to outmigration is explained by factors like low prospects and opportunities for education, employment, and healthy living. Now climate change is considered a primary global driver of migration. And from my research perspective, resource securities are theorized to be very key determinants that are driving it further. The types of things that I look at involve kind of a shift from traditional look at the traditional research on large-scale climate migration events, those that are more punctuated in nature, triggered by extreme weather events such as drought, storms, floods, and so forth. There are many fewer studies of climate migration from the perspective of how it interacts with the types of factors that Alejandro was just talking about, the background social, economic, and political processes that shape everyday resource insecurities, food, water, energy, and so forth. And I spend a lot of time studying how water insecurity is a part of this. And we think of water insecurity as this pathway between climate migration, between climate change and migration as, and pardon the pun, this invisible slow drip of migration. And so a lot of the work that my team is doing is proposing these alternative frameworks that flow from climate change through various resource insecurities, such as water insecurity, to migration, but all shaped by the types of poor governance that Alejandro was just talking about. You can't really separate the two.
Herns, I want to turn back to you again and have you share with us this incredibly important concept that you've developed, you and your team, the trauma signature of climate disasters, and how these play into the lives of our communities. Help us to understand that idea.
Yes, well, and I agree with Alejandro when he mentioned Professor Cortes when he talked about the need for us to differentiate the impacts of disasters on populations. In fact, one of the key theory that emerges out of this differentiation is the fact that what today, with the magnifying effect of climate disaster, multiplying effect of climate change on vulnerability of people, we find that the impact, the footprint of each disaster, the footprint that they leave, are absorbed differently by different groups of population. And we have developed this trauma signature to be able to calibrate, register, and understand what are the differentiations that a particular disaster can have in terms of impact on the particular populations, and how these impacts are in turn differentiated between those who are already vulnerable and those who have been totally marginalized. For example, in the case of Haiti, we have seen, let's take something, the event of January 10, 2012 with the earthquake. Again, we go back again to what you were saying, Professor Cortes, about the importance to take into consideration both the social processes that places people to vulnerability, but also the natural processes, what I call the bio, geological aspect of it. When the earthquake hit Haiti, what magnified the disaster was not just the potential, the power, the magnitude of the earthquake itself. It was the political, socio-historical decisions that we have made to make a country totally concentrated around Port-au-Prince, to make all the administration of this country around the capital of Port-au-Prince, to make all the universities of this country around Port-au-Prince, all the administrative centers around Port-au-Prince. And this concentration has also led to a concentration of different layers of vulnerability. A city without good urban planning, a city without good networks to access its own vulnerable populations, a city organized around, slums and at different layers, and who don't have access to, all the basic services that they need. And a mountainous country in which you have the positions in which people will inhabit are positions that nobody would accept in any kind of normal circumstances. So when the earthquake hit, you have a configurations of concentration of population, concentration of marginalization, concentration of vulnerability, but also that makes the country also more vulnerable than other countries, because after that, you have 20% of the, of all of a population disappear just like that. 20%, of most higher education institutions, of the state governance, the national institutions, that they, organize this country, and so forth and so on. So yes, when we talk about trauma signature, we are talking about social configuration of populations, social configuration of vulnerability that make people more susceptible to different types of trauma that are not registered, by regular ways of us collecting, data on population. Most of the time when we talk about, traumatized populations, we talk about mostly the psychological trauma. We do not have the equipment enough to assess the social trauma that comes with it. What in terms of, connectivity, in terms of social organization, in terms of, all those intangible things that make people live in a community, that make living possible. We don't see how the wall has crumbled, but the wall that has crumbled was not just the buildings. Or when the hurricane hit, the wall that has crumbled is not just the wall that has been built environment, but also the wall that people have imagined, the connectivity that people used to have, the possibilities for them to create, safety for children, for the environment, for their lives, and then to reproduce. So the concept itself allows us to understand precisely the variability of impact of climate disaster according to variability of context of vulnerability.
Ernst, thank you. And it actually, that is an ideal lead in to a question that I have for Adele, but I think that it will go back and forth on this. And I'd like to hear from all of you, which is this question about how do you go about assessing, and we were going to say non-economic losses, but I could speak as an economist, which I am, a mistrained economist, I guess, but I think it's non-economic. Describing something as non is not perhaps the right way to do it. It's the myriad of loss firms that you were just speaking about. So how do we go about assessing that? And how can a policy landscape, let's think national policy, then we can think of global institutions, how can it mitigate those losses? Adele, I want to have you speak to that first, if that's possible.
Sure. So non-economic losses and damages, as I call it in my research, is incredibly important. It's things that we may think of, like the trauma associated with going through an extreme event, the things, just the sense that your home may not be here due to climate change. So for places in coastal communities with sea level rise, what is it like to tell a child, within the next 50 years or so, this area may not be here? Or, the loss of grave sites where, your ancestors are buried that are being eroded away by coastal erosion. So these are incredibly important things that we need to take into consideration. But unfortunately, what I found through my research is that it's not being taken into consideration. We did a study on Hurricane Irma and how it affected people in Ragged Island. So Hurricane Irma back in 2017, it actually caused the entire population of Ragged Island to have to be evacuated from the islands because the island was deemed uninhabitable. And it was 72 people that were on the islands. The Prime Minister came in and said, you all have to leave. That's a huge deal. That was the first time that the island was unoccupied since it was initially occupied. And the government was incredibly slow in trying to rebuild. was reliant on international funds, so from the IDB in particular, and the IDB had come out and said, it's not cost effective for us to rebuild because it's only 70 some people. But the tenacity of the people from Ragged Island were like, we will rebuild and we will do this ourselves if we have to. But it just goes to show that if you don't take into consideration those strong, sense of place and ties to place, and if you don't take that into consideration, if you do a cost benefit analysis, then it's going to look like we shouldn't continue to invest in certain places. Just like with New Orleans, with Katrina, it was like, should we rebuild, the Fourth Ward or wherever else? And these are where vulnerable people are living. So it brings up equity and justice issues. How do we go about assessing loss and damage? Is a big question that's open. I think we start with acknowledging its importance. So even though we can't put dollars and cents to it, it is incredibly important, and it plays a role in how we continue to decide where we live and who we support, et cetera. And we found through our research that the majority of small island developing states don't have any policies or plans in place that consider non-economic loss and damage. It's all about what are the dollars and cents. And so I think a first step to moving towards policies is to actually get policymakers and decision makers to see how important this is in considering, what happens after an event, where do we protect from slow onset climate change events, et cetera.
And one thing that is fundamental in this process is we have to put people first. If people are not first, if we don't go to people, in fact, what will happen, the model that we have been seeing in the Caribbean, particularly in Haiti, and during all those, disasters and recovery model that we have been seeing, have been international organization of government deciding through material assessment what exactly those particular communities, particular group needs in order for them to recover. But at no moment, there is no process to gather from those very people who have been affected to understand what is loss, what constitutes loss for them, and how do they can build on what they understand as loss. What do they have as asset? And how do we build on their understanding of loss so then we can reinforce what they have as asset? Because we always think when in our theories of vulnerability, in our theory of victimization of people, we always think that those who have been victims of particular disaster or particular forms of unjust or structural damages on earth in situations of life, we always think that these people are, they have nothing at all. We assume that they are not, they don't have the ability to rebound just because of the fact that they have been neutralized, by a huge process that are bigger than them. People do have access in communities. So the way for us to build on those vulnerabilities, on what exactly to address these vulnerabilities, is to know exactly what these communities understand about what they have lost, but also about what they have. We have done this experience in Haiti, in the south of Haiti, after Hurricane Matthew. After Hurricane Matthew, the only thing that it's a long story short, but one of the key interesting things that we found was that people rely on their local networks of family networks, community networks, and informal associations that they used to have prior to the event for them to, collectively rebuild however they can. Now, international organization and central government goes to these communities that have been destroyed, and they come with a particular model that imposes them a model of recovery, but that negates that these people have associative lives. These people already have networks that have been working prior. These people have been able to, generate locally driven mechanisms in order for them to respond. Why can't we map out those assets, acknowledging their losses? Why can't we map out those assets and build on those assets? And that's what we have been doing with about 6 communities in the south of Haiti, in which that the prior women-led organizations, informal cooperatives, that used to operate before the hurricane hit. They used to operate in very extremely dire situation, but they still organize their own assets and capital to put them together in order for them to, invest in business. And we have done what we have done. I've been to map out these informal institutions and to instill capital in their own plans. And which is totally complementary to whatever the state can provide, whatever outside institutions can provide. To make a long story short, in order for us to address loss, to address vulnerability, it is important for us to put people at the core.
Right. And I want to get back to that gender question, but I'd also like to hear Alejandro and Justin thinking about you. I would frame it as, how can we value the alleviation of suffering? This is actually the general question here. And we do not have any metric in health either that evaluates the alleviation of suffering or looks at the cost of human suffering. And I'd like to hear, do either of you have any further comments on this? Alejandro, go ahead.
I will jump on this to say that that Hearn is absolutely right. This is what we call, we call in the social sciences social capital, mobilizing the community network and the social capital that exists in communities that are often the only resource of the poor, because the state is absent or ineffective. So that beginning with strengthening those community ties and working from the bottom is very important. But I would summarize I think that our session, I think that in the following way, I think that we are addressing this existential threat of irrecuperable cataclysm. We have to proceed in two directions. One is the technical one of seeing, that is monitoring global warming, monitoring the rise of the ocean, the technical aspect. And the other is a social and political one of strengthening our institutions. Many states, unfortunately in the Caribbean, which is so subject to this natural disaster, are rather weak states. They are either corrupt or ineffective. Same in Central America, and that magnifies the losses that is experienced by the population, and including the most vulnerable groups like women and children. So we need to work on the state institutions and also on non-state institutions that are often a counterbalance to bad thieving governments in many of these places, and with an emphasis on prevention. I think that prevention is in educating the population on preventing, on being ready for what is coming next. That states have been woefully incapable and inoperative in doing this, in training the population of people who are in very vulnerable areas about what is going to come next. It happens even here in Miami, despite the fact that we are in the advanced world. People have no idea of when the next hurricane is going to hit or what they are going to do. The institutions that have been creating are rather feeble in comparison with the existential threat that South Florida faces. But those, to me, Felicia, would be, I would say, the two pillars: technical and socio-political. And we need to work in both if we're going to try to prevent or at least ameliorate what comes next.
Just to go ahead and take it in that direction. I think that's exactly where we wanted to go. But I'm curious also about our global and regional institutions, what I would call the global public goods that we need to develop to offer to national leaders and also to civil society.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to go exactly in the direction you're leading me, but just to echo what the other three panelists have said, I mean, Hearns has kind of hit the nail on the head that this is more or less a measurement problem, and we are at a resilience symposium, I say with a little bit of irony, right? It's the other side of the coin from vulnerability. What are people's capabilities, not just the risks? And I think there are significant implications for international development initiatives and disaster recovery initiatives that potentially can stem climate migration, or at least delay it and make it more voluntary again, eliminate a lot of the forced displacement we see, particularly after disasters. In many realms, we're still using 20th century metrics to measure these types of things that are focused on vulnerability and risks and not on capabilities. And we're trying to revolutionize that kind of measurement in the water domain, at least, with measurements and scales that are more experiential, right? Understanding how people interact with water and understand the types of social and political contexts in which people interact with their environment and secure drinking water for their households and communities. And water is a good example of a resource that obviously is typically affected after a major hurricane or extreme weather event. When communities lose water service, what do the disaster recovery teams do? They drop in with, pallets of bottled water and say, this is what you should all drink now. But a lot of the research we've done over the last few years shows there are quite extensive water sharing networks and relationships that are based on kinship ties and community relations and so forth that are often much more efficient in being able to fill gaps in services for water and electricity and other types of resources where households are actually quite resilient and can help each other. And these cookie cutter disaster recovery strategies are often less efficient and kind of undermine people's natural ability to help themselves. So there's a lot that we can learn from that. And we can measure these non-economic or whatever we're calling these alternative types of factors.
I still think it's about the alleviation of human suffering, but we can argue that one through. An issue I've done a lot of work on. So we have a very interesting and important question from the audience. I just want to say that I will ask you to close with, I'd like to hear us discuss a little bit around gender in all of this. So keep that in mind. And in the meantime, it's an anonymous attendee who's asking, many academic journals have published research questioning the impact of rapid border closures, which resulted in forced immobilization or containment of migrants during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many border control measures are still in place. Can the panelists describe the disconnect between national policymakers and migration researchers and how this relationship could be strengthened before future pandemics? Now, I think that it's the second part of that that we should really address, which is a general question, which is why is our research reaching the people it needs to reach to do what it needs to do or not? And if not, what can we do about it?
Well,
Sorry, Alejandro. Adele, next, please. Go ahead, Alejandro.
It's a permanent disconnect between scientists and the scientific community and what is doing government, because that is academic research, and what we find is based on ultimately on the standards of truth, while that is a political machinery and so on is based on the standards of power. And therefore, especially in most administrations, it's very difficult to establish this dialogue. In the course of this epidemic that we have been following over a year and so on, figures like Dr. Anthony Fauci has repeatedly stressed follow science. You have to follow what you need to do in the middle of all of this. And he had been a great voice educating the population on the importance of this. His points are well illustrated, but in the course of the pandemic, by the significant variation in the effects that the virus have had in different countries with different sociopolitical features and different state apparatuses. So you have New Zealand and Taiwan and and Korea on the one side, doing that, and you have Brazil and Colombia and Peru and countries in Africa doing the other. So that
Mexico.
The virus is the same. The virus is the same, and the contagion is the same. But the response, the preventive and the response by state organizations have been very different. That is the point that I have been making throughout this panel, and I hope that we take away that it is not simply the climate or the ocean. The ocean is going to, but the ocean is neutral. The ocean is not going to respond to exhortations. The way that sea rise is going to be is a human enterprise, and it varies greatly. It varies greatly from from country to country. I think that this is where we can do, and I think that that whenever academics and social scientists can engage policymakers in this dialogue, they should do so, because it is an important thing. We cannot be confined to publishing our findings in academic journals. We have to actually try to engage in this dialogue. Sometimes it's impossible, as in the last years of the American administration. Now it is much more possible.
Alejandro, I want to make sure, because you only got a few minutes left, sorry to interrupt, that we can go around. I can't resist but say that many of those leaders happen to be or identify as female, and that certainly is a difference. But let me turn it over to Adelle.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it brings up more broadly the role and the value of science in policy making. And I think in the climate change community, we have been talking about climate change and the dreadful impacts that are going to be occurring for decades now, which finally came to a head with the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, which is like, listen, we have so many more years to act. And after that, you know, we are going to be facing really catastrophic impacts. And so I think scientists have been trying to do a good job in relaying our findings, but I think it really comes down to political will, if there's interest in actually listening to what we're finding through our research. And for developing countries in particular, it's, do we have the capacities and the resources to translate what we're finding from research into things that we can actually implement? So in speaking, you know, with different institutions in the Bahamas after Dorian, they felt that they were prepared for hurricanes, but Dorian overwhelmed their capacities. And they're like, you know, we can only do so much with the limited resources that we have. So I think we have to be sensitive to that aspect as well. And with gender issues, I will say that I think definitely having more women in positions of leadership and more women contributing to discussions on policies and how we can improve things will definitely be to our benefit, as we saw with leadership with COVID in particular. Thanks.
I'm trying to avoid echo. Justin or Hearns.
Yes, so the aspect I wanted to take on that one, yeah, those are very good points. The point that you know, Adelle and Alejandro made on this, but also there is I think that there is a problem with the way that we in academia we generate knowledge in a silo, highly codified, published in highly technical journals, and that are not necessarily accessible. You know, works that are not necessarily accessible to, you know, people who are in the world of the political, you know, in the world of bureaucracy. And most of the time, our work, research questions are totally detached from the social dynamics, from the reality of the world, and from the possibility for making this research question convertible, you know, to convert it from the academia, the academic world, you know, to the very political world that we want to impact, or to the very social world that we want to impact. So there is some effort that we also in the academia needs to do in order for us to open the process of research, not just the results of research, the process of research to, you know, organizations that are outside academia, to communities that are outside academia. And you mentioned gender. I mean, academia is highly male controlled, right? So an engagement with different, you know, organizations, local communities, different institutions, groups that work on other gender issues, other topics that fall outside of our jargon in the academia, you know, and will help the research process and lead the process to results and publications that are more accessible to people. And another point is that also we have to consider also is that we still operate in the academia with the real world is extremely complex, but our disciplinary perspective forces us to simplify things, to modelize them into a particular discipline, economy, epidemiology, sociology, anthropology, etc., and so forth and so on. We still operate in the silo, and we are not able to create that interconnectivity that the real world asks us for. Because of the process of globalization, because of the process of climate change impact, you know, on social lives, all the things, the categories we used to think of as, you know, self-contained categories, communities, groups, borders, countries, etc., have been destabilized. We need new tools, and to find new tools, we need to intellectually, academically, epistemologically create greater connection between disciplines and with communities. Otherwise, we will remain in the silo. So no wonder that you know, colleagues would ask you that question, that we are ineffective and ineffectual in terms of, you know, giving back.
Kearns, I need to cut you off so we have one more minute. I'm sorry. I just want to let Justin have a chance at this question if he'd like, and then to close and guide our audience to the next session. Apologies.
I also wanted to hear the end of Hearn's thought, but I'll add another idea here. We do need to work harder, you know, within the academy to depoliticize a lot of these issues, and migration is a great example of that. That migration has been tremendously politicized. It's a factor that has enabled the rise of populism around the world on almost every continent. And when going back to the attendee's question, when COVID-19 struck, it was not just, COVID-19 basically became another means for government to further restrict migration. And it wasn't just closing borders, it was the lockdowns that restricted human movement within borders. And when in fact, there are many examples throughout the world where reversals of your typical migration trends, seasonal workers, you know, emptying out of cities and returning back to rural areas, which had positive effects in decreasing, you know, urban densities and things like that, would have been good decisions to foster. But again, the politicization of migration and other types of issues, it limits the choices that we have and leads to bad politics. So we can all do better.
So I'm going to sum up and say that there are a number of very important topics, ideas that came out of this panel, but that what we're asking is to think through, assess, relate to, and address the many kinds of suffering, the non-economic costs that we know that migrants, forced migration means for individuals in our region and around the world. Now, I want to direct those in our audience. I know we sent a message already out. Brandon, thanks very much for that. To the final session of our symposium, which is coming up next. We can click on the link on our schedule page. We have that now. It's been added by Brandon to the chat box to join the final plenary session and closing remarks by President Julio Frank, President of the University of Miami.